Hello and welcome to Jerry's Live. My name is Michaela Westra and I'm going to be your host tonight. And I am very excited about tonight because we are going to be talking about encaustic. Before I jump in though, I do want to let you guys know that today's class code is JL339. It's down in the corner over on this side here. If you pop that in the search bar on JerrysArtarama.com, that will show you our teacher's cart, everything that we are using tonight. Now, another thing, before we get started, is I want to kind of talk about what encaustic is, because I know a lot of people might be learning what this is tonight. So encaustic is a wax medium used for wax painting. Encaustic is made up of typically 3 different materials. It's made up with beeswax, damar resin, and pigment. There are usually different variations depending on what kind of wax you're getting, and I'm going to kind of jump in with safety as well, because as fun as this medium is, I want to make sure that you guys are safe with using it, because there are hot surfaces and I have accidentally bumped my hand on a hot surface before. So to use encaustic wax, you have to melt the wax and work with it while it is hot. So I have a lovely pancake griddle in front of me. This is going to keep all my wax paint hot and liquid so that I can use it and brush with it using a brush. And so sorry, I'm a little nervous. I'm very excited about this and I want to do this justice. So another safety thing is we have a heat gun. This is also going to be something that's hot. This metal part here will get very hot, and if you touch it, you don't want to burn yourself. This heat gun has a little lever here, which is super handy dandy, so that I can have it sitting up like this. If you are clumsy like me, I would have it sitting on the side, just in case you tend to bump it over. But those are the main safety things. Ventilation is also very important. Having a good ventilated space when working with encaustic, because if it gets too hot, it can release some fumes. Not bad if you're holding it at the right temperature, but having that ventilation is super important. The temperature is going to be 200 degrees or lower. It has a melting point of somewhere between 150 and 200, depending on what wax you're using, but staying in that limit is going to reduce any harmful fumes. So now that we have all of that safety stuff out of the way, let's jump into the fun stuff. So when you're working with wax, like I said, I use brushes, and as the wax dries or comes back to room temperature, it becomes hard. And so I know a lot of people get confused when using brushes, because once your brush is dry, they become very hard. I'm going to show you 2 different things in regards to this. One, you can clean your brushes so that once they are dry, that your bristles are still flexible. However, you don't have to clean your brushes. Once that hardens, you can put it straight onto the griddle here, warm it back up, and your bristles are right back to being nice, flexible, and usable. So I was just having this here so I can show you guys just how soft those bristles get while they're hot. And I can keep it on here. It's not at a temperature that it's going to burn away at my bristles. And that is because the brushes that I'm using are all going to be natural hair. I'm not using anything synthetic because those bristles will melt. So while I'm on that topic, I'll kind of walk through the brushes that I have today. I have some hake brushes. These are typically used in like wide washes with watercolor. But these are so nice because these are natural goat hair. They're very smooth. You can put on a really nice even coat of wax using these in wide widths as well. So I also have some natural chunking hair bristle brushes. This one was cleaned to the point where the hardened wax isn't quite hard anymore. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit later. But all of my brushes are going to have a natural bristle. And I'm actually just going to jump in with how to start a painting. So I have a nice wooden panel here, the Da Vinci birchwood panel. And the reason I chose this panel is because when you are painting with wax, it does get brittle as it dries. So you want to make sure that you have a very sturdy surface. So I like to use wood or very hard panels. Another thing that is important when choosing your surface is making sure that it's porous. If you have a really hard metal, it has that stability, but it's not going to be able to adhere to that surface. So wood is perfect because when that is hot, that wax can kind of seep into that texture of the wood and it adheres to that super well. So jumping right in, the best way to start, I like to just start with the colors that I want to use. So I can go in with this hot wax here. I'll kind of pull it down with my brush and I can apply it right away. And you can kind of see, I'll keep going until it dries. That's how fast that paint dries. So you want to work fairly quickly. I know there are some artists that work with their heat gun while they brush at the same time so they can get that paint to extend a little bit more. But now my bristles have that hardened wax on there. I can use the griddle as my palette to clean off my brush. And I just use rags or paper towel to wipe off that excess wax while it is still hot. And then this over here, this is a different type of wax, and I have it off to the side so I don't confuse it with my other waxes. This is a soy wax, and this is going to be a lot softer than the other waxes that have that Damar resin in it. So using that, this is going to be my cleaning wax. It's going to take off all of that pigment and hard wax and resin so I can start cleaning off my bristles. And I can keep using this until that soy wax comes out clean. I'm not too worried about it right now because I'm going to keep painting. And cleaning off your palette is also super easy because it's hot. All that wax on there is still liquid, so I can just go in with my rag and wipe that up. I can also go in with just a little bit of that soy wax, clean off any excess if I need to. And again, I'm keeping this off to the side so I don't confuse it with my other waxes. Especially with, and grab another little clothespin. I have a white and a wax medium. And I'm using this little clothespin, what is this called, a clothesline?
Clothespin.
Clothespin, okay, perfect. I'm using this because these are all in metal tins, keeping that wax hot. Those metal tins are also very hot. I use these to help kind of maneuver them around my palette if I need to. Super handy dandy. But I can sometimes confuse these three because they all look very similar. This is my wax medium. That is just going to be that beeswax and Damar resin. This is going to be my titanium white encaustic. So this is the Damar resin with the beeswax as well as that titanium white pigment. And then this is my soy wax. I always want to make sure that I kind of am able to identify the difference between them because they have their different purposes. And if you have more than just these, I know there are more encaustic wax mediums out there that do different things like lowering the melting temperature or raising it to kind of create like an impasto technique or a very smooth, shiny surface. So being able to kind of identify the difference between those is kind of important as well. So jumping back into the painting, I'm going to go in with this nice purple I made, which is not quite melted enough, so I'm just going to put it straight on the palette here, melt it down. Okay. So while I'm adding this to the panel, the more layers that I add, I'm going to want to heat it and set it into the panel. And I'm going to want to do this in between every layer that I do because I want each layer to be fused together. If I don't fuse layers together, those layers can flake and separate. So I'm going to show this especially with this nice purple I put on here so I can melt it into the panel a little bit more. Another thing is when you fuse your layers, you want to make sure that you are kind of removing that brushy texture, or at least I like to do that. So that's kind of how you can tell that it's fusing. Another identifier of seeing that fuse is that glossiness. Once it starts to look glossy, it has melted and fused to the layer beneath. And you can kind of see as that gloss kind of disappears, that's it drying. So I'm going to keep going. It looks like my palette it keeps kind of saving its heat. So once it reaches that temperature, it kind of turns off and settles to save power. So I apologize for that. It's kind of turning down right now. Alright, so besides adding paint directly to the panel, I know there are some artists, myself included, that like to start with a panel with a few layers of just straight wax medium. So this has about 2 layers, I think, on here of just wax medium, and that's kind of like a primer, just to have a layer of wax on top all ready to work with. So without cleaning my brush, I'm going to jump into that teal and make a nice blue. And literally just brushing it onto the surface, you can create more than just abstract images. We have a question?
We do. Is the wax easy to remove if you make a mistake or want to make a change?
Absolutely. Especially if you do it this way, where you have a few layers of wax medium on the surface already. I actually have a few pottery tools here. I have this big scraper tool, this tool here with 2 different edges, and a needle tool. Using this scraper tool is probably the easiest for something like that. Let's say I don't like this purple over here. Sorry if there's any not so fun noises. You can literally just scrape off layers to kind of reveal something underneath or remove something. It's super easy to get rid of something and try again. And the best part is these shavings aren't wasted. So if you remove something, you can take these shavings, add it back into your wax palette, and it will melt and join the rest of the paint. Great question, thank you. So besides that, I really wanted to talk about a few different techniques when you're working with encaustic. So besides understanding what it is and how to work with it, I wanted to show you kind of fun ways to use it. So I have another kind of panel. This is still a birch panel that's got really nice deep cradling. And I prepped this with, I can't even remember how many layers of color, but each layer I put on here is a different color. And I'm going to show you 2 different things with this panel. I'm going to show you stenciling, and I'm going to show you mark making. So with mark making, I have these 2 tools that I use. You can literally just carve into your surface. You can also go in with a thicker carving tool and release, or reveal, I mean, different layers of color below the surface. And when you do carving like this, one thing I want to let you guys know is make sure that it is fully cooled. You don't want to scrape away or carve into it while the wax is still a little warm, because it's still going to be soft. When you're carving, you kind of want it to be hard. So again, I have those little shavings. I'm just going to add it to my palette, let that melt. Another thing that you can do with this, I'm going to keep carving a little way, is you can fill those lines that you create. And that's one of my favorite things to do. So if you use this needle tool and you create little images or drawings, you can fill those lines with color. And there's a few different ways that you can do that. One of them is actually using oil paint. So I have some Tuscan Pine paint here, some burnt sienna, and I'm going to take this and a rag, and I'm just going to put some of that and rub it into those lines. And then I will buff away that paint from the surface. Another way you can do this is you can use extra soft oil pastels, you can use oil sticks, anything soft enough that's not going to break that wax surface and can kind of fit into those crevices. So as well as mark making, I wanted to talk about some stenciling. So I actually have some tape here, and I love kind of creating different shapes with sharp edges using stenciling, because when you fuse layers, that top layer is going to become liquid. And sometimes if you heat that layer for too long, you can kind of blur out your image or lose those sharp edges. This is my favorite way to create sharp edges in encaustic work, is I will block out the shapes that I want. Right now I'm just going to do a little stripe here. And then I'll go in, I'm just going to mix what I have here. Interesting muddy green. Maybe I'll add a little bit of white and blue to that, get more of a fun color. And I'm literally just dipping my brush into that hot wax and mixing everything on this palette. And I will brush this onto the surface. Now we have a good heat temperature. And I like to fuse this layer before I peel off the tape, but you don't have to do that. Something to note is, depending on the tape, when you heat before you peel it off, you can get that kind of tapey texture set into the surface. So it's totally up to you. It does dry super quick, so you don't really have to wait. He's stuck. Here we go. Peel that off, and since I did have a little bit of a ridge there when I was carving with that needle tool, it did kind of seep under the tape, but that is okay. Again, you have to heat in between each layer. I shouldn't say have to, because I'm going to talk about something later that you do not have to, but typically you want to fuse every layer so you don't have any peeling in between. Especially if you are carving into the surface, you can sometimes flake off a top surface that isn't fully fused. And you also don't want to stay in one spot for too long. I'm going to kind of show you, if I hold it in one spot for too long, it starts to liquefy. And if you want to preserve that texture or whatever you have in that area, want to make sure. I heard of the saying, chase the shine. So you're following that shininess, that melting point, and that's kind of stenciling and mark making. You can go really detailed and realistic with this medium, especially using these types of techniques. So that's super fun. Another thing that a lot of encaustic artists use is embedding. Now, embedding is basically just melting things into the wax. And I have a few different things here. I kind of went foraging, and I have some outdoor items. I have some, is this, you guys called it pine straw?
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you call it?
Pine needles.
Oh.
It's very weird. Apparently down here they use pine needles for like gardening.
They call us the land of the pines. Like, we gotta do something with it.
It's like mulch. They usually.
Yeah, it's mulch. I haven't seen that before.
I didn't know that wasn't a everywhere thing.
We use like wood bark. And then I also have just a dried out leaf. Both of these are dried out. I will say from experience, you can put live plants in the wax. However, they will continue to dry out under the wax, and they don't always look pretty in the end. So I always like to make sure now that my items are dried out, so I don't have to worry about that.
So it sounds like we learned that the hard way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Most definitely. So having things like this that are not super flat like paper can be a little tough to embed into the wax. Now this has, I want to say 3 or 4 layers of color and 2 layers of just wax medium. So that's why it looks so nice and soft. I love putting just plain wax medium on top of my colors to kind of blur everything and smooth everything out. But I'm just going to go in with wax medium. And I like to start with something a little bit hot and liquid so I can stick it to the surface. And then I will just brush over top to seal that in. And then I'll fuse, and that will remove those brushy textures. And another thing is, while that wax is hot, it is transparent. While it is warm, it gets kind of cloudy, but once it cools down, it will go back to being slightly less cloudy than it was while it was still warm. So that's a good way to kind of figure out at what stage the cooling is. Another question?
Yeah, so I'm gonna summarize it.
Yes.
Because we have several versions of it.
Mm-hmm.
We have someone in Australia, and it's
Oh,
like
hi.
24 degrees Fahrenheit there right now. And then we have people in like New Jersey, and it's hot there.
Yes.
So when it comes to encaustic, how does like your climate affect it? I know you've lived a bunch of different places.
Mm-hmm.
And then do you have to worry if it's too hot if it will remelt?
The melting temperature is pretty high, so if you're over 100 and something degrees, I wouldn't leave it straight out in the sun. But other than that, it's usually fine. The cool temperatures, if it gets too cold, that wax can become so brittle. If it's on something flexible, it can kind of crack off. But if you have something sturdy, temperature-wise, it's not as big of a deal as you would think because it has that Damar resin in it. It kind of raises that melting temperature and kind of creates more of a hardness. I will say that I have worked in the middle of the summer, in the middle of winter, in a studio that doesn't really have temperature regulation. Sometimes you can use that to your advantage in the middle of winter. I would put my hot panels in the windowsill and let them cool so I can go straight into carving and scraping. And same if you have something in storage and you want to keep working on it. If you put it in the windowsill on a hot day, you can kind of make it a little bit soft. It's not going to melt it, but it's going to make it easier to work with if you're painting on it or something along those lines. Does that?
I think so.
Okay. All right. Now, I'm actually not going to put this in here just because I feel like that's going to take, well, maybe I will. Maybe I'll do that last. I do want to show this because I feel like this is kind of like a magic trick. So these are just some random drawings that I did on rice paper. This is a very thin paper, and that is very important for something like this, especially if you want it to be kind of like magic. So I'm going to go in with these two figures here, and I'm going to line up where I want this based on my drawing and not how I cut the paper. So I line up my drawing, I'm going to kind of stick it down to the wax. You don't have to put a layer of wax on top of this before you do this, but I'm just going to kind of secure those edges a little bit so it doesn't blow off when I heat it. I'm going to take my heat gun, and this is going to heat the wax underneath the wax paper, or not the wax paper, the rice paper, and it's going to melt into the wax and leave just your drawing behind. And depending on the wax paper, or not the wax paper, oh my gosh, the rice paper, or whatever paper you use, it can be more apparent or less apparent. And this is just traditional rice paper. And you can put another layer of wax on top. And the more you put on top, the less you'll see that paper if you want it to completely disappear. Another thing that you can do if you want it to completely disappear, this is something I used to do very often, is I would do a drawing on a very large sheet of rice paper, or slightly bigger than the size of the panel that you're working on. Melt it into the surface and cut off those edges to match the edges of your panel. Another question?
What medium did you use to do that drawing with?
I believe this was just a fine tip Sharpie.
Is there anything you shouldn't use other than like a crayon?
That is a good question. I feel like if you use a crayon, that crayon wax will melt as you're fusing it, so I actually wouldn't use crayon. Anything that doesn't really bleed when coming in contact with moisture. I haven't really found many things that wouldn't be good besides the crayon. So if you find something, or I'll even experiment with it and let you guys know. But most of the things I've used, especially my favorite is colored pencil. Most things work pretty well. Alright, I'm going to try and stick this in here now. Now this is going to require another layer of that encaustic wax. I'm going to try and stick it in here first. The materials that you use, you're going to want to try and be as flat as possible. If it sticks up, like I'm going to tear this off, if it sticks up off the surface, while that wax is hot while you're fusing, it can lift up again. So it will stick as it dries, but you want to make sure it stays as flat as possible. So this may be a little tricky, but we're going to try it. So I'm going to go in with just that straight wax medium again and try and brush that down into the surface. And when you are adding layers, the more layers you add, the less you're going to see what's underneath. So that's why carving and removing layers is so much fun, is you can reveal what you've already done underneath. And I'm just laying that wax on there as thick as possible because that stands off the surface quite a bit. I want to make sure it is fully embedded into that surface. All right. And kind of like I was saying, where you don't always have to fuse the surface, this is something that if I was having this in here, I might not fuse this final surface. And that's because I want this to stick on here. Again, you can definitely fuse this in here with a little bit more time and patience. But I probably won't do that for this one. So, on that note, the next technique I want to show you is something super fun and is very intriguing to look at. It's called Accretion, and it is basically unfused layers creating really fun bumpy texture. And before I jump into that, this is a different panel that I used besides those Da Vinci birch wood panels. This is the Da Vinci Resist Grip panel. This is going to have a nice textured kind of gesso-y surface versus just the plain birch. The reason why I like this as well as the birch panel is because it is sturdy, it is porous, but it's also going to react a little bit differently from the wood. With the wood, it's more porous than this Resist Grip, and when you are heating the wax into the surface, air bubbles can release from the wood as you are melting that wax. With something like this, you don't get quite as many of those air bubbles as you're heating. So that's something fun to note. Now, for the accretion, I'm going to try and add different colors with every layer. And like I said, it is just layered, unfused wax to create texture. So I'm going to add wax to my brush, and I'm not going to have too much on here. I'm going to kind of dry brush it onto the surface. You can also, I'll kind of create a ridge. So when you add lines with that needle tool, it kind of, as you push it in, that wax kind of creates a valley, and it kind of lifts up on the edges. So that's always fun when you're doing accretion because it already has some level or raised area to work with. So I'll have a little bit of that on here as well. And this takes quite a few layers, but we'll kind of make some fun colors as we go. If you guys in the chat, if you have any fun colors in mind, I'm going to try and do a different color with each layer. Again, I'm making my color, making sure I don't have too much on my brush, and I'm lightly dry brushing that on the surface. And the more layers you do, the more you're going to notice that texture. I'm already starting to see a little bit of texture. If you go to that dynamic camera, you can see those little bumps starting to form. So right around here, these little bumps, the more of that dry brushing you add, the more those bumps are going to be super prominent. Do we have any color suggestions yet?
Copper.
Copper. Oh, that's a great one because I actually have that. Let me add this kind of yellowy color here, and then I'll pull that out. So now you can kind of see those bumps start to raise. The more of this you add, the bigger those bumps are going to be. So you can kind of see that already. And you can definitely keep going. But because of that copper suggestion, I have Encausticos hot sticks. And they have all these beautiful metallic colors. And you can tell that copper is my favorite. So I'm gonna pop that out of here. Show you how to use that. Encausticos has so many different variations of their wax. I also have in the sticks some light tones, some pastel-y colors. And what I'm working with on my palette here is actually their starter kit. There we go. And in here is everything that I have up here. They have that red, blue, titanium white, bismuth yellow, wax medium, and that slick wax is going to be that soy cleaning wax that I was using. They also have these super fun wax snaps. So it's the same thing, hardened wax, you snap them off and just drop them in a little tin on your palette. This is that fun cobalt teal that I was using. And these are the palette cups that I was using to melt those wax snaps. Another question?
More of a comment. The
Yes.
wax snaps are also great for if you are writing down your own color formulas.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're already pre-measured.
Exactly. So yeah, these you can just pop in those tins and melt them and have them already in there in a large amount. These sticks, you can do the same thing, drop that stick in there and have a large amount. I like to use it on my palette and just swirl it around, let it melt. I love watching this up close. I don't know if you guys can see this. Can we get this on the dynamic? Mm-hmm. Let's see. Okay. I love seeing that glitter just move around while it's hot and wet. I'm so sorry. All right. I'm going to add that copper to my accretion.
As we're talking about that,
Yes.
Once this becomes a wax griddle, it's no longer a pancake griddle,
Yes.
right?
That is very correct.
Very good point.
Once you use this with wax, do not make pancakes on this. Even if you clean it off, you're still going to get wax on your pancakes, and I would not recommend that.
And then Nola was wondering if this always leaves like a milky surface.
No. If you are using several layers of just that wax medium, it can start to get milky in thick layers. This has started to cool down. That thickness over here has started to become less milky. If you're using just straight pigmented encaustic wax, you're not going to get any of that milkiness because it's already going to be super pigmented. I'm actually going to clean off my brush before I grab that copper. Another fun thing to note on the metallics for encaustic is once you finish a surface, you can polish it. And I would definitely recommend polishing your metallics because that's really going to let those metallics shine. So I'm going to add an accretion layer to this with that copper. And I'm also going to do a little swatch to the side just so we can see how that looks polished up. Let's add a little swatch of that off to the side. We're gonna fuse that, let it melt. I don't want to fuse my accretion, so I'm gonna kind of point it away from my accretion area. And again, I'm looking for that shine. Once it starts looking shiny, maybe even once those brush strokes disappear, that's gonna be when I stop and pull away.
Robin was wondering, would you be able to do this on thin slices of wood for jewelry or pendants or anything like that? Or would you think that it might rub off?
I don't know if I know exactly what she's referring
Like,
to.
could you make like a pendant for a necklace or something?
Oh.
With encaustic?
I think you would. It would be a little susceptible to being dinged. So I would not have it be wearable. I know you can make jewelry that's not wearable. But yes and no. Another question?
I have several over here on YouTube. For starters, how do you polish the metallics?
Yes, I'm just about to show you. So here's that kind of metallic on the surface. You can use like a microfiber rag. I like to use my hand because it does just as well. So this is it without being polished. I'm just gonna go on there with my finger. You do want to usually wait once it is fully dry and cooled. I'm gonna try and get it a little polished. You can kind of see it along the edges there. There we go. And I'm going to add a couple more layers of that accretion. Any other color recommendations?
We had gold and maroon or hot pink over on YouTube.
Ooh. Okay. I don't really have a hot pink, but I have this really nice kind of peachy color. And I might add a little bit of red to that to see what I can get. And then said gold. And I have a nice maroony purple already mixed, so we're gonna do that as well. So let's go ahead and clear off my palette so I have more space. And gloves, I was wearing one glove and I took one off. You don't necessarily need to wear gloves. I like to wear gloves because if you get this wax on your skin, it's not really going to hurt you, but it's gonna be really hard to get off. So I just like to be take an extra step so I don't have to worry about getting that wax off my hands. So I'm gonna go ahead and melt some of this on here. Did we have another question?
Yes. What kind of brush technique would one have to use to paint a realistic portrait?
That is a good question. I have actually done that, and it is going to be very small brushes, very small brush strokes, and being very careful with your fusing. So I can actually, interesting little flesh tone here. You can definitely go in and you're really going to layer. Maybe I'll go in with that nice purple. But it's going to be slow process, slow layering. Using your brush, fusing it together. You can even scrape away to create a smoother surface. It's just going to be a slower process using a small brush. Yeah, nothing super unique when it comes to brush strokes. It's just the same as painting with any other medium. It's just going to be, you're going to be working a little bit faster and stopping to kind of fuse in between layers.
You mentioned earlier on that your griddle is set to between 150 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit to melt your paints.
Mm-hmm.
But what about your heat gun? What setting do you put that on?
So on the back here, maybe, can you switch to the overhead? On the back of my heat gun, it has the temperature control on here. This is the RNF heat gun that we have. So it's going to be between 250 to over 1,000 degrees. I like to keep it at a medium, and that's mostly because you're not holding it on top of it for a super long time. You're just holding it there until it melts, and then you're taking it away. I wouldn't go all the way to super high and hold it over your painting for forever. That might not be fun for your painting. But keeping at medium to low is good, especially with your heat gun. You're not holding it there for a super long time. You're not going to be creating fumes and smoke with your heat gun. But that's a great question. Thank you. All right, so we had our pink. Adding this to the accretion. And this is such a long process, but it's so satisfying once you get that fully built up accretion texture. And then you had that, what was it, maroon? Maybe a little bit more of that red in there. Again, not a lot. Dry brushing that on there. And then we'll end with that gold. I also wanted to kind of end off the show with finishing those edges. So let's add some gold, finish up this accretion. Again, I'm going to clean off my brush and just using that soy wax again, or that slick wax from Encaustic, clean off my brush. Add some of that gold. Yes, another question?
Yeah, Nola was wondering if you can use any brand of oil paints with the wax, and then do you have to treat it a certain way if you do? You have to like seal it?
You have to sandwich it.
Yeah.
I would sandwich it. The type of oil paint you use, I don't think it matters. I use so many different kinds of oil paints, and I use so many different kinds of oil sticks, oil pastels. Really doesn't matter what kind you use. But let me end off with a lighter color to kind of show off that accretion. And then we'll talk about finishing those edges. So I just wanted to end with that lighter color so you can kind of see that accretion building up. And this is just a few layers. You can keep going to the point where it raises off the surface of your panel by like, I don't want to say an inch, but pretty close to an inch. It can get pretty tall depending on how far you go with it. But that accretion is so fun to build up on a surface there. All right, now talking about edges, everyone has a different preference. So some people really enjoy these drippy edges. I personally am not a fan. You can be super careful and make sure that it doesn't drip off the edge. I wasn't super careful on this side, but that's okay. You can be super careful and make sure it doesn't drip off the edge. I like to tape off my edges. So this one I actually taped off the sides so that as it drips down, I can peel that tape off and have a nice wood surface. Which, let's see if that actually happened. And this is so fun. I used to do this for hours, just peeling tape off the edges of my encaustic and watching that hardened wax flake off with the tape. I think it's super satisfying, but it's also a huge mess. So if you do that, be aware with your flying wax shavings. And now I have some nice wooden edges again. I love seeing those wooden edges, especially when I'm using these birch panels. But those are the techniques I wanted to cover today. To finish up, I want to talk about what we're going to do next week, because this is a two-part show. Today I was kind of introducing you to what encaustic is, the possibilities, the safety, but next week we're actually going to be doing a full realistic painting. So those of you that were asking about going into realism and portraits, I won't be doing a portrait, but I will be doing a realistic painting and kind of walking you through step by step. So definitely, if you had fun kind of checking out this medium today and you want to paint along with me, please grab those supplies in the teacher's cart. Again, that code is JL339, and join us next week and kind of paint along with us. It's going to be so much fun. But I'm actually going to end off today with that. Are there any other final questions from the chats before I sign off, dance off? No questions? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me. Thank you for being patient with my favorite medium. I hope you guys enjoyed. And I hope you guys join us next week. I will be here again for that part 2. And if you want to join our Jerry's Live Facebook group, check out the other things that we have done, other things our followers and watchers have done, please check that out. Don't forget that we have that one security question in order to get in. But then you get to see everything and all of our followers. Hashtag at JL.
Hashtag JL339.
339. Yes. But I love seeing what you guys post and seeing what you guys have taken from our videos. So again, thank you guys for coming. I'm going to head out and I will see you next week. Bye.